Well, there she is. It came up missing. Okay. What size do you want? Just I did bring a few more copies of the handout I gave out last week. There's no new handout tonight. We're just going to do some reading in Ezra tonight and talk about the text. Thank you, Roy. We may refer to that. Feel free to take notes on that, write on it, mark it up. It's yours any way you think it might help you. This is a class on Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra was sent back to Jerusalem by King Cyrus, and he went back to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Had over 40,000 Jews returned to do that work. And Nehemiah followed about 70 years later. He went back to rebuild the wall around Jerusalem. All of this is after Judah had been taken off into Babylonian captivity. How long had Jeremiah prophesied that they would be in captivity before they would return? Anybody remember? 70 years. 70 years in captivity, and then they would come back. So now they are returning, and that's what Ezra and Nehemiah are all about. Let's go to Ezra. You may have noticed the placement of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah in our English Bible. The reason they are where they are is because they're at the end of the 12 books of history. And they are the latest history book chronologically of all those that are in there. So that's why they have that placement in the English Bible as they do. We're going to read in Ezra, and here's what I think I'll do tonight. I think I'll make some assignments. Oh, I divided it up into big chunks, but not smaller chunks. For verses 1 through 4, Donnie, would you read Ezra 1 through 4? And then let's see, Bobby, would you read Ezra 1, 5 through Ezra 1, 5 through 2:2. We'll read both of those sections. Now here's what we'll do. Donnie will read, and then we'll stop and we'll discuss the first 4 verses a little bit and what's going on there, and then Bobby will read, and we'll come back to what he's read. Incidentally, or I guess I should tell you, if you're looking at chapter 2, we are not going to read the detailed account of the sons of and the men of and all their numbers. We'll skip over that. I know. I was going to assign that to you, Robin, but it's fun to have letters and numbers in your reading. But all right, Donnie.
Sojourning.
I like that. Sojourns. Be assisted by the men of this place with silver and gold, with goods and with beasts, besides free will offerings for the house of God that is in Jerusalem.
And they had to
fathers' houses of Judah and Benjamin.
Let him go. Turn him loose. Let him go. It's all right. We were gonna talk about the first 4 verses a little bit before we went on, and I didn't make that clear enough. He's fired up. Going to get that reading done. Maybe we should let him go before it fizzles out. All right, the first year of Cyrus. Cyrus was a Persian king. And when it says the first year of Cyrus, we're not talking about the first year of Cyrus's reign. If you go back and you study the history, it might be a little confusing because actually Cyrus has been king for about 20 years, but he's king of Persia. When it talks about him, this being his first year, this is his first year as the king who took over Babylon. Now, here's some more possible historic confusion because the people who would have read these things when they were first written would have known how everything went down. We have to study it and get all the details out. You might read about Darius being the one in, for instance, go to Daniel chapter 5. Daniel chapter 5. Daniel was a contemporary with Ezra and Cyrus, would later be a contemporary with King Darius. Because there was more than one Darius. And I don't want us to get bogged down in the complicated historical facts. I just want us to have some simple framework to kind of see this on, so we have some idea of the chronologically. But really, there's a very rich spiritual and faith-building story behind so much of this. But in Daniel chapter 5, do you have a title for that page or for that chapter? What's that? Handwriting on the wall. Belshazzar's feast. Belshazzar was the last of the Babylonian kings. He threw a big party. Do you remember what he used to celebrate in that party, to have his festive? He said, bring out all the stuff from the temple that was captured when we sacked Jerusalem. Bring all that stuff out. So they brought all that stuff out, and they essentially mocked the God of the universe. And so as they were partying and being drunk, a hand appeared and wrote on the wall. And I like what it said. It says his loins were loosed and his knees smote together, the old King James says. That's how scared he was when he saw that hand writing on the wall. I read something recently about the handwriting on the wall. It says most of us see the handwriting on the wall. We just think it's addressed to somebody else. But he saw this handwriting on the wall, and he knew that it was something big, but he didn't know what it was, and so he got Daniel to interpret it, and God gave Daniel the interpretation. And in verse 25, Daniel gives him the interpretation. This is Daniel chapter 5, verse 25. This is the inscription that was written out, many, many tekel upharsin. And this is the interpretation of the message, Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the scales and found deficient. Peres, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. And then Belshazzar gave orders, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a necklace of gold around his neck and issued a proclamation concerning him that he now had authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. That same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. So Darius the Mede. But what this doesn't say, Daniel's account doesn't say, is who put Darius in charge. Who put Darius in charge was Cyrus. Cyrus was king of Persia. He took Babylon and put Darius in charge of Babylon, just like you've got the president of the country, but the president has a country of 50 states, and every state has its own governor. And every state has several towns, and every town has its own mayor. This is just kind of the chain of command. I like to look at things simply. I like to think, okay, who's king? Cyrus. Okay, that's the end of it. No, wait a minute. That's not the end of it. Cyrus is king, but Darius is on the throne in Babylon because he was the king of Babylon, but now, or Belshazzar was king, but now Darius is king because Cyrus made him king, put him in that position. Have I muddied the waters completely, or is anything helping at all? to get a picture of what's going on here. Okay, so when Cyrus takes over Babylon and puts Darius on the throne, this is that same year that we're reading about in Ezra chapter 1. In the first year of Cyrus. And remember, Cyrus has been reigning for about 20 years, but this is the first year of his reign as he has taken over Babylon. That's what this is all with reference to, what's going on with Babylon. And in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, Daniel goes back and references Jeremiah. If you look at Daniel chapter 9, it says, Daniel 9, verse 1, in the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus of Median descent, who was made king over the kingdom of the Chaldeans. He was made king over the king. He didn't take the kingdom. He was made king. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, observed in the books the number of the years which was revealed as the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet for completion of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. So I gave my attention to the Lord God to seek him by prayer and supplications with fasting, sackcloth, and ashes. A couple of reasons why I wanted to bring this in. Number one, I want you to see these guys as contemporaries. Daniel and Ezra are contemporary. Cyrus, king of Persia, has put Darius on the throne in Babylon. And this is the first year of Cyrus's reign in Babylon through Darius. Also, Jeremiah's prophecy of the 70 years of captivity is coming to a conclusion. And Daniel is paying close attention to that. And what does Daniel do after he looks into this 70-year prophecy that Jeremiah has made? What is it? How does Daniel respond at this point? It's there in verse 3. He sought God by prayer, by supplications, and sackcloth. And what he does is he confesses to the Lord the sinfulness of his own people. When we read through Ezra, Ezra's going to do exactly the same thing. When we read through Nehemiah, who comes about 70 years after Ezra, Nehemiah does the same thing. All of these guys who were spiritually attuned towards God have the same thing in mind. Oh, Lord God, we are sorry, we have messed up. And they weren't even the ones who were there when Israel went off track. But they feel such a sense of responsibility to their forefathers that they're apologizing to God for the sins of their fathers in many, many decades gone by, which I think is a great spiritual lesson for us, to look at the way their people have gone and apologize to God for that, confess those wrongs, to repent, to be heartbroken. What was it that the Apostle Peter said about Lot? His righteous soul was vexed as he saw the unrighteous deeds of his neighbors in Sodom and Gomorrah. And that's what's the situation with all three of these guys and many others who are not even written about. Okay, so we've got that. Verse 2 of Ezra, chapter 1, verse 2. Cyrus, heathen, pagan king, as far as we know, says, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he's appointed me to do what? Build him a house. To build him a house. Ezra is about returning to rebuild the temple. Nehemiah is about returning to rebuild the wall. That helps me to keep these two guys in mind. And there's about 70 years in between Ezra returning and Nehemiah returning. These things are happening over quite a bit of time. In verse 3, whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. You ever noticed how he said that? Cyrus if this is to be taken at face value, doesn't have a real clear, accurate picture of who God is. God is not the God who's in Jerusalem. That's where his temple was. But you may remember it was not God's idea to build a temple. Whose idea was it? It was David's idea. He asked to build a temple, and God said, have I asked you to build a temple? So, no, I didn't ask you to build a temple, but here's what I'll do. I'll let you build a temple, but not you, David. Why didn't he let David build a temple? David had shed a lot of blood. God told David, your son coming after you will be a man of peace. He will build the temple. So at that point, David immediately began to amass great wealth so that when Solomon came to the throne, everything would be ready for the temple to be built. But the temple was not God's idea. And as human beings, the idea was that there were different gods for different places. And so Cyrus is talking about God in this context as being the God who's in Jerusalem. But he's honoring God and sending his people back. Johnny?
King Cyrus, do we know how he knew of God?
No.
Okay, all right. So he didn't know of him through Daniel. Well, I guess he could have. Or Ezra.
Well, I don't believe so because this is the first year. And he's taking over Babylon, and Babylon has been where Daniel has lived. And I don't know if he even knew who Ezra was or Daniel was, but somehow he knows. Yes. Yes.
It was common back then when you took over from your enemy to release all of your enemy's enemy. It wasn't just Israel going back home, it was other people from other conquered lands. Because if you did not release these people, they become your enemy.
The only thing we know about this release,
It wasn't only Israel.
well, I don't know that there's any record of any other nation going back, but
It was common back there to release the
do you know of any specific instances where people were sent back? Do you know of any specific instances where any other people were sent back? Because Israel's the only one I know about where they were sent back, not only with the king's approval, but with funds from the king, to go back, not just to go back and live where they had lived, but to go back and rebuild the temple. That was what this was all about. And he is talking as though God has sent him to do this.
It was the Jewish slant on it that even the king says, this is the God of these people. So therefore, they would also have gods of other people that was captured.
Well, when you say the Jewish slant, what do you mean when you say the Jewish slant?
Well, it was written by the Jewish people the Jewish scribes for the Jewish people. That's
Sure.
historical fact.
But was it inspired of God?
Inspired of God?
Yes.
Yeah, it would be inspired.
So if it was inspired of God, my assumption would be that the way it's written is just as accurate as the facts that are recorded. So rather than there be a biased slant, nevertheless accurate. Isaiah had said, before Cyrus was even born, Isaiah chapter 44 and 45, we read this last week. If you were in class, you might recall. I've called Cyrus. He will be my servant. He will send my people back. And Ezra is giving us the historical perspective on exactly when and how this happened. All right, verse 4. Every survivor at whatever place he may live, let the men of that place support him with silver and gold, with goods and cattle, together with a freewill offering for the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. So 3 times in this first 4 verses, he's talked about going back to build the house of God, going back to build the house of God, going back to build the house of God. That's not the last time it'll be mentioned, but it's made very clear, just in these opening verses of Ezra, what this is all about. Now keep in mind, Ezra doesn't go back here. Ezra doesn't come until later. Ezra will come as the ambassador of the king to check on what's going on in Jerusalem And as a result of his coming later, he writes this history out for us. That's the way that's going to work. All right, Bob, yeah.
How long was it before Ezra back to Jerusalem?
I don't remember exactly how long it was. It's like 16, I think it was 16 years from when they returned, but now I'm going off.
So basically, it was from the fall of Jerusalem to Ezra's return was 80 years, approximately.
From Ezra's return. It was more than the 70 because he didn't come with the first bunch. All right, Bobby?
The fathers' houses of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites, with all those whose spirits God had moved, arose to go up and build a house of the Lord which is in Jerusalem. And all those who were around them encouraged them with articles of silver and gold, with goods and livestock, and with precious things, besides all that was willingly offered. King Cyrus also brought out the articles of the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken from Jerusalem, and put in the temple of his gods. And Cyrus the king of Persia brought them out by the hand of Mithridath, the treasurer, and counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judea. This is the number of them: 30 gold platters, 1,000 silver platters, 29 knives, 30 gold basins, 410 silver basins of similar kind, and 1,000 other articles. All the articles of gold and silver were 5,400. All of these Sheshbazzar took with the captives who were brought out from Babylon to Jerusalem. Now these are the people of the province who came back from the captivity of those who had been carried away, whom Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon had carried away to Babylon, and who returned to Jerusalem and Judea, everyone to his own city. Those who came with Zerubbabel were Jeshua, Nehemiah, Seraiah, Realiah, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mizpar, Bigvai, Rehum, and Benaiah, the number of men of the people of Israel.
And then we start with the specific numbers. And you might notice down through those as they give the numbers, sometimes it says the sons of so-and-so, and other times it says the men of. So in some cases it was the sons of whoever the father was, in other cases it was just the men of a particular city or locale. But that's how they were accounted for, divided up into those kinds of groups. Now if you notice back in chapter 1, verse 5, the heads of the fathers' households. This was a patriarchal society where the father was the head of the clan, the grandfather going on all the way back. That's why we have the 10 tribes of Israel are named after the fathers. And it says, the households of Judah and Benjamin and the priests and the Levites arose. We have a pretty good idea probably who the priests are. Who were the Levites? They were the guys that took care of the tabernacle first, and then they took care of the temple. The priests served as priests, offering up sacrifices. The Levites were priests in a sense, but they were more caretakers of the tabernacle and the temple. And these guys still know who they are. They know what tribe they're of. They've been in captivity for 70 years, but they still know their lineage. They still know their genealogy. We'll see more about that a little bit later. And who was stirring them to go? God was. Cyrus is the one who said, here's my proclamation, I'm sending you back. But in truth, God was the one who was stirring them up. Well, how did the people respond who weren't going? Some were going, some weren't. What did the ones who weren't going do, according to this text? They supported them with finances. If they didn't have money, they gave them goods, gold, cattle, valuables, and these were things that they were providing for support. What did Cyrus do? Everything that had been taken out of the temple and from Jerusalem, he brought all that stuff out, said, here it is, pack it up, take it home, rebuild that temple. they enumerate all of these things, then it's a little bit interesting to look at all of that. But when you look down through the names, chapter 2, verse 2, there are two names, the first two names, Zerubbabel and Jeshua. Zerubbabel would be the governor. He would be the one who's in charge of all these guys going back, and Jeshua would be the high priest. So they had a governor, Zerubbabel, and they had a high priest, Jeshua, or Joshua, as his name will appear other times. Now, right after Jeshua is Nehemiah. It appears, nobody knows for sure if this is the same Nehemiah who's going to write and give his history later on. It might be, some argue that it is, but remember there's 70 years or so between Ezra's return, or between this return in Ezra and Nehemiah's return. So he would have been a fairly aged guy if he went with the first bunch and then led the second bunch. Doesn't mean it's not him, but he would have been a fairly old fellow by that time. All right, questions, comments, observations? Yes, Bobby.
Mentioned a while ago about Cyrus releasing these, the Jews, but he didn't release all of them at once either. This was like an exploratory group going down first, and we'll see how they do and how they function out from under us, and then we'll send some more a little bit later. So he did it in stages rather than all at once.
And it wasn't necessarily a real smooth operation as far as they went back, and in 6 months they had the temple built and everything was fine. They had opposition. They were in fear. They go back, and they don't have a wall, remember. What was the wall for?
Protection.
For protection, for defense, but they didn't have a wall. So they're going back into a hostile environment to rebuild the temple, and the text reflects that they were worried about that later. And they had an opposition. The building came to a halt. Later on had to be cranked up again officially through official royal channels. But also God sent prophets to say, what are you doing sitting around? Is it time for you to build your house when God's house hadn't been built yet? Those were the messages essentially of the prophets when they came back to fire the people up for this work again. Which, I mean, if you think about it, when you start something, you get all fired up, don't you? And then if things don't necessarily go as flowery as you had planned, do you ever get discouraged? And that's what happened. So in this historical account, like every other historical account God provides, we're seeing what really happened with the people. It's not like some fairy tale where everybody's a big, strong hero and nobody ever does anything wrong or gets discouraged or down in the mouth. Have any of you ever been through the Mormon tour up in Salt Lake City? Whose hand is that? Is that Judy? Yep. Was there anything about that tour that struck you, especially about the artwork? Don't mean to put you on the spot, but. Okay. I remember it's been quite a while since I was there too, but they've got all this beautiful artwork, and I don't mean little paintings on the wall, I mean big, huge paintings, and in all these paintings that depict the predecessors of the Mormon Church, you see these guys with big, it's like every one of them's Arnold Schwarzenegger, and all the women are beautiful and voluptuous and got flowing locks of hair, and they kind of look like white people too. Interesting to me. What's that? Anyway, I thought, that's not what people look like. When you turn on the TV and you see national leaders gathered around in some kind of a conference, I'm going, who's that old guy? Oh, that's the president of so-and-so. How do you get to be president? Look like that. We're just people. We look like people. Not everybody has bulging biceps. Not everybody has flowing locks of hair. But when you look at that artwork, that's what you see. And I'm not trying to pick on the Mormon Church. I'm just saying, when you read history, you get down to the nitty-gritty of what it was really like. And God doesn't paint a rosy picture of people's spirituality either. he tells us about their weaknesses and their failures and how they had questions about what they were doing. They weren't as courageous and bold the way we might think we would be if we were back there. So that's another thing I like to see when I read through the scriptures and the accounts that God's provided for us. All right, chapter 2. Let's see. We're going to read verse 58 through 65. It's not very long. Boyd, do you want to get that? Ezra chapter 2, verses 58 through verse 65. We're sort of getting an account of the total of the people here, but more detail than that about some qualifications.
The temple servants and the descendants of the servants of Solomon were 392. The following came up from the towns of Tel Melal, Tel Harsha, Kerub, Adam, Immer, but they did not show that their families were descended from Israel. The descendants of Tobiah, and Nakoda, 652, and from among the priests, descendants of Tobiah,
Very good.
Hekos, Barzillai, a man who had married a daughter of Barzillai, the Gileadite,
Yes.
and was called by that name. These searched for their family records, but they could not find them, and so were excluded from the priesthood as unclean.
Three more verses.
The governor ordered them not to eat any of the most sacred foods until there was a priest ministering in Urim and Thummim. The whole company numbered 42,360, besides their 7,337 men servants and maid servants, and they also had 200 men and women singers.
All right. And then we go on to talk about the horses and cattle and donkeys and all that. But what I wanted us to see in this is that there were these guys going back who believed that they were of the priestly tribe and even of Israel, but they couldn't even prove they were Israelites. There were no records. There had to be some kind of an accounting. And it says, verse 62, they searched among their ancestral registration, but they could not be located. Therefore, they were considered unclean and excluded from the priesthood. There wasn't the idea of, let's just give them the benefit of the doubt. What had caused Israel's downfall? They were lax with regard to the law. That was their downfall. They got off into idolatry. They gave up the law. And so now they're going back and they're saying, we're not going to do that again. We're going to make sure we do this right. Just like when David tried to move the ark and Uzzah put his hand out to stop it, and God did what? He struck Uzzah dead. David got angry, but after time, David thought about it, and he realized, we messed up. It wasn't God's fault. It was our fault. We didn't do it right. He went back to the books and said, okay, here's how to move the ark. We're going to move it again, but this time we're going to do it right. We're going to do it according to the book. And now they're doing it according to the book. It's interesting. It has been postulated. I don't know that it has been proven. But when Jesus came, he talked about all of the regulations of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Have any of you ever seen a copy of the Mishnah? It's about that thick. The ones that I have seen. It's a big, thick book. It's about twice the size of the Bible. All the Mishnah is the Pharisaic interpretation of the law and how you had to keep the law specifically. For example, you had to wash your hands. Okay, how much water did you have to wash your hands? Could you wash your hands with a tablespoon? Is a half pint enough? Do you know how much water the Mishnah says you have to properly wash your hands? It had to be as much water as could fit into the mouth of an adult ewe sheep. In the first place, how do you do that? Where do they come up with this stuff? Another regulation, of course, what could you not do on the Sabbath? You couldn't do any work on the Sabbath. The Mishnah explains what is work. If you are a tailor and you put your sewing needle in your garment, because that's a good place to have it, that's evidently what tailors did, and you finish your work and you forget that you have that needle there, and you walk out of your shop and the Sabbath overtakes you, you are guilty of bearing a burden on the Sabbath. This was the Mishnah. And it's postulated that the reason they got to this point was they said, we really messed up before. We didn't keep the law. We're going to make sure now we really keep the law. And so they wrote all these extra laws to make sure they kept God's law. And Jesus comes along and he says, if you're not over here, you're over here. And that's what he had to deal with. And of course, he found himself at odds, not with the law, but at odds with the traditions of men. Washing of hands. What did Jesus say about the washing of hands? It's not what goes into a man's mouth that corrupts him. It's what comes out. Because what comes out comes from the heart. So this may have been some of the beginnings of that, but we got to give them credit because they're trying to get it right. They're trying to get it right. Questions, comments, observations? Well, yeah. It's a bunch of guys, and I have to give them the benefit of the doubt that they were trying to do this right, but apparently at some point it went over the edge and it just became too much. So that's just some commentary on that. All right, chapter 3, 1 through 7. Everybody's ducking their hands. Robin, you want to read 1 through 7 in chapter 3? No numbers for you, but hey.
The Israelites had settled in their towns. The people assembled as one man in Jerusalem. Then Jeshua, son of Jozadak, and his fellow priest, and Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and his associates began to build the altar of God of Israel to sacrifice burnt offerings on it, in accordance with what is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. Despite their fear of the peoples around them, they built the altar on its foundation and sacrificed burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both the morning and the evening sacrifices. Then in accordance with what is written, they celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles with the required number of burnt offerings prescribed for each day. Where am I supposed to go to? I'm sorry.
Down through verse 7, I'm sorry.
Sorry, forgive me.
That's all right.
After that, they presented their regular burnt offerings, the new moon sacrifices, and the sacrifices for all the appointed sacred feast of the Lord, as well as those brought as free will offerings to the Lord. On the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, though the foundation of the Lord's temple had not yet been laid. Then they gave money to the masons and carpenters and gave food and drink and oil to the people of Sidon and Tyre, so that they would bring cedar logs by sea from Lebanon to Joppa, as authorized by Cyrus, king of Persia.
All right. So getting back to Jerusalem, there are these little towns around Jerusalem, and everybody's kind of settling in, going back home, getting settled in. Okay, we're set up here. We got our camp made or whatever they've got, so that they can sleep and live and have a place to call home. And then they meet in town. They meet in Jerusalem. What's the first thing they do? They rebuild the altar, and they begin to offer sacrifices. They don't have everything yet. They just have the altar. But they've brought the animals for sacrifice, and they're getting a start. What we're seeing here is an honest attempt at restoration. They're trying to restore what has been lost. The Church of Christ is known as a restoration church. Not because we go back to the late 17 and early 1800s and Alexander and Thomas Campbell. Why are we known as a restoration church? We're trying to get back to the book. Just exactly like they were doing, they're trying to get back to the book. Did you see what they said? What's written in the law of Moses, the man of God, chapter 3, verse 2. They're trying to get back to that and do it that way, do it God's way. That's what we're trying to do. Do we get it perfect? We're not perfect individually, so we're not going to be perfect as a group, but we're doing it the best we can. We're making our best effort. So, that's what they're doing. What are they worried about? What do they fear? Well, they did fear the wrath of God, and that's why Ezra and Nehemiah, and we read about Daniel, all offering up these apologies to God for their past sins. But now they're afraid of the people. They've come back, and we've been away for 70 years, and some strange folks have moved in, and they are not all open to the idea of Jerusalem being rebuilt. But they celebrate the Feast of Booths. They set everything up the best they can in the time they've got. And then it says in verse 7, they gave money to the masons, the carpenters. They're hiring contractors is what they're doing. Hiring contractors, they're providing for raw materials and resources, because you can't just go down to Lumber 2 or Lowe's and get what you need. Stuff's got to be brought in. And so they not only give food, not only money, but food and drink. Why would they give food and drink? See, that wasn't easy to come by either. Hey, you gave us some stuff we can eat here. And probably what they were providing, I don't know this, but probably a lot of what they were providing were the kinds of things that had been prepared ahead of time that would last. Cakes of grapes, cakes of figs, not cakes like we know cakes, but dried figs and dried grapes that have been pressed together. The kinds of things that they would see as very valuable. Oh, okay, we can make a trip to Lebanon to get these cedars. We can go wherever we need to do. In other words, whatever they were providing is what these guys needed to go get what was needed and bring it back for the building of the temple. And it was all, once again, verse 7, based on the permission they had from Cyrus, king of Persia. We're going back to the royal authority, Cyrus as God's servant that God was putting in place to get all this done. All right, observations, questions. For us, we're looking back at history, but I want you to try to imagine what it would have been like for them. Coming back after 70 years. God was the one who kicked you out, but now you're coming back. And not everybody wants you to be back. And it's going to take a while to get everything established the way it should be. Lord willing, next week we'll go back into, we'll do some more reading in chapter 3 and beyond. We won't read the entire book of Ezra, but hopefully we'll read enough of Ezra and then move on to Nehemiah, so we've got a pretty good handle on what's going on. If you have any questions between now and next week, please write them down and bring them to class with you, and we'll try to address those. Thank you all.